On the morning Clara Whitfield decided to leave Pennsylvania for good, she stood in her dead father's study and counted the debts on his desk, and understood that there was no version of the arithmetic where she got to keep her life. The house would go, the furniture would go. The name her father had spent 30 years building would be spoken in that town for another generation as a warning, and Clara, who was 24 and unmarried, and suddenly poor, would be folded into someone's back room as a charity case, mending and minding and slowly disappearing. She had read the advertisement a week before the funeral, and not let herself take it seriously. A rancher in the Dakota Territory, a man named Thomas Garrett, seeking a wife of education and steady character, to share a working concern and a life far from the comforts she was used to. He was honest about the hardship. He promised nothing soft. He promised, in fact, mostly weather and work, and Clara had read it and felt, against all her training, something in her lift toward it. Now, with the debts spread across her father's desk like a verdict, the advertisement stopped being a fancy and became a door. She wrote to Thomas Garrett that night. She told him the truth, that she was newly orphaned and newly poor, that she could read 4 languages and keep a complex set of books, and had never in her life cooked a meal that did not arrive at the table already made by someone else. She expected the honesty to end it. Instead, it began everything. He wrote back that a woman who could keep books was worth more to a struggling ranch than a woman who could cook, and that he would teach her the second thing if she would handle the first, and that he had read her letter twice and liked the person in it. He sent a ticket. Clara packed one trunk, sold the rest, and rode west, out of the only life she had ever known toward a man she had never met, telling herself the whole way that this was a transaction and not a hope, and not quite believing it. Her father had been a good man and a bad businessman, and Clara had known the second thing long before the funeral made it everyone's business. He had lent where he should have collected, and trusted where he should have doubted, and he had died believing his daughter would be provided for, which was the one debt Clara could not forgive him, the debt of his own hope. She stood in his study among the creditors' letters and felt no grief for the money. She felt grief for the certainty, the lifelong certainty that she was a person things would work out for, peeled off her now like a coat in a wind. The women of her acquaintance had already begun the gentle cruelty of planning her future for her. A position as a governess, perhaps. A companionship to an elderly aunt in Baltimore who needed someone to read to her and bear her temper. Every option was a small room and a closed door, and every woman who proposed one did it kindly, which made it worse, because kindness is harder to refuse than cruelty. Clara had nodded and thanked them, and gone home and read a rancher's advertisement by candlelight until she had it memorized, and the candle had burned down, and somewhere in the dark she had stopped thinking of the West as a last resort, and started thinking of it as an escape. The conductor who took her ticket somewhere past Chicago asked if she was traveling to family, and Clara said yes before she could think better of it, and then sat with the small lie for 100 miles. She was traveling to a stranger to make him family by arrangement, which was not the same thing, and was, she supposed, the entire wager of her remaining life. Other women her age were settling into marriages built on years of knowing. She was betting everything on 90 days of letters and a ticket, and the only collateral she had was her own judgment of a man's character through his handwriting, which her father, the bad judge of character, had also trusted, and look where it had left him. 600 miles west, the man who placed that advertisement was not the man who wrote those letters, and that distinction would come to matter a great deal. Thomas Garrett owned the ranch. He was the elder Garrett, the one with the name on the deed, a hard, handsome man of 35 who was good with cattle and money, and bad with nearly everything else that mattered. He had wanted a wife the way he wanted a new well or a better fence, as an improvement to the operation, and he had placed the advertisement in that spirit. What he had not wanted was the work of the correspondence, the careful answering of a stranger's careful letters, and so he had handed that chore to the one person on the place he trusted to do it and not complain. His younger brother Daniel had come to the ranch 4 years before, with a limp from the war, and no prospects of his own, and had made himself useful in the quiet, thorough way of a man who knows he is there on sufferance. Daniel kept the books Thomas could not be bothered with. Daniel gentled the horses. Thomas was too rough to gentle. And when Thomas shoved Clara's first letter across the table and said, "Write her back, you're the one with the schooling," Daniel had taken it and read it, and recognized in the woman who wrote it something he had given up expecting to find anywhere, least of all in his brother's mail. He told himself it was a chore. He answered as Thomas, in Thomas's name, on Thomas's behalf, and he was scrupulous about it, careful never to write a word his brother could not have meant. But a man cannot answer a soul honestly for 3 months without putting his own soul into the answering, and the letters that crossed the country to Clara Whitfield were signed Thomas Garrett, and were, in every line that mattered, Daniel. He knew it was wrong. He told himself, the night the ticket was sent, that when she arrived he would step back into the shadows where he belonged, and let his brother have the wife he had paid for, and that the woman would never need to know whose heart had actually been on the page. He believed he could do that. He was wrong about that too. Daniel Garrett had not meant to stay at the ranch 4 years. He had meant to heal his leg and move on. But a man with a limp and no capital finds the world has fewer doors than it advertises, and Thomas had needed a bookkeeper, and 1 season had become 2, had become a life lived in the margins of his brother's. He did not resent it, mostly. Thomas was hard, but not unkind, and the work was honest, and a man who has watched other men die in a war learns to be grateful for a roof and a purpose, and a brother who keeps him on, even when the keeping is half charity. What he had not had in those 4 years was a single conversation that asked anything of his mind. The hands talked of cattle and weather and women in town. Thomas talked of money. Daniel had a head full of the books he had read in the long convalescence after the war, and no one in 600 miles to say a word of it too. And then a letter had come from a woman in Pennsylvania who read 4 languages and missed the smell of her dead father's study. And answering it had been like finding water. He told himself, every night, that he was only doing his brother's chore. He knew, every night, that it was the only hour of his day he felt like a whole man. Clara rode west for 9 days, and Daniel waited east of nothing for her to arrive. And across those 9 days, the two of them, though they had never met, moved toward each other, along a line that had been drawn in ink. She reread his letters on the train. She had them in order in a ribbon, and she took them out at every long stretch of empty country, and read them again. And the man she built out of them was patient and dry and unexpectedly tender, a man who noticed things. He had asked her once what she would miss most, expecting her to say the house or the comforts, and she had surprised herself by writing that she would miss the smell of her father's study, the leather and the pipe smoke and the ink. And he had written back that he could not give her that smell, but that the ranch office smelled of leather and ink at least, 2 parts of 3, and she had laughed alone in an empty house at that, the first time she had laughed since the funeral. Daniel, meanwhile, was unraveling the lie in advance and finding no clean end to pull. He could not tell Clara the truth before she came without exposing his brother as a man who could not write his own courtship. And Thomas, for all his faults, was still his brother and still the man whose name was on the roof over Daniel's head. He could not tell Thomas what he had done, because what he had done had no name that did not sound like betrayal. So he did the coward's thing, which is to do nothing and hope the situation would resolve itself. And he rode out to meet the stage with his stomach in knots, and his brother beside him in a clean shirt, and he watched the dust of the coach come up over the rise. "What do I say to her?" Thomas muttered, suddenly nervous in a way that was almost human. "You wrote all the letters. What does she think she's getting?" "A fair man," Daniel said, "who works hard." It was true, and it was not enough, and he knew it. Just be that. She'll do the rest. She wrote him a letter from the train itself, posted at a stop in Ohio, knowing it would likely arrive after she did, but needing to send it. In it she told him she was frightened, which she had not admitted to anyone, and that she was trusting a man she had never met with the whole remainder of her life, and that the only thing that made it bearable was that the man on the page had never once given her reason to doubt his honesty. Daniel received that letter the day before the coach, and read the line about his honesty, and went out to the barn and stood a long while with his forehead against a stall, because there was no honesty in any of it, only a kindness wearing his brother's name, and the woman trusting it was already on her way. The coach stopped and the door opened, and Clara Whitfield stepped down into the Dakota dust, and the two threads that had been running toward each other for 3 months finally met and snarled. Thomas stepped forward with his hat off and his clean shirt on and said, "Miss Whitfield, Thomas Garrett, welcome." And Clara looked at him, this hard, handsome stranger, and waited to feel the thing she had felt reading the letters, and felt nothing, felt only the polite flutter of meeting any new man, and told herself it would come, that the page and the person were always different, that she was tired from the road. Behind Thomas stood a quieter man with a limp, holding the horses, who did not step forward and did not speak, and whose eyes, when Clara glanced at them, were doing something complicated that she could not read and would spend weeks failing to forget. She nodded to him, taking him for a hand. He nodded back. Neither of them knew yet that they had just been formally introduced to the person they had actually been writing to. The wrongness announced itself slowly, in pieces, over the first days. Clara would say a thing to Thomas, a small private thing from the letters, a joke about the smell of ink or a reference to something he had written, and Thomas would look at her blankly, would cover it badly, would say yes, of course, and change the subject. She told herself a man could forget his own letters. She told herself it 3 or 4 times. Then one evening at supper she mentioned the line about the ranch office smelling 2 parts of 3 like her father's study, the line that had made her laugh alone in an empty house, and Thomas Garrett had no idea what she was talking about, and across the table the quiet man with the limp went very still, and Clara Whitfield, who could read 4 languages, finally read the room. The first night, Clara lay awake in the room they had given her, a clean, plain room with a window facing the dark shape of the barn, and tried to make the man at supper fit the man in the letters, and could not. Thomas Garrett had been courteous. He had carved the meat and asked after her journey, and said the right empty things, and there had been nothing in him of the dry tenderness that had made her laugh alone in an empty house. She told herself it was first meeting stiffness. She told herself a man is not his best letters. She had nearly convinced herself by the time she slept. It was the small things that would not let her keep convincing herself. A man does not forget the running jokes of his own courtship. He does not go blank at a reference to a thing he wrote 3 weeks before. Clara had built her understanding of Thomas Garrett out of 90 days of careful correspondence, and the man at the table did not know his own mind as she knew it, could not pick up the threads she offered, and a woman who reads 4 languages knows the difference between a man who has forgotten a text and a man who has never read it. She just did not yet want to know what that difference meant. By the 3rd evening, she had stopped being able to pretend, and the not pretending was a lonely place to stand. She could not go to Thomas and say, "You are not the man I wrote to," because how does a woman say such a thing? And what if she were wrong? And where would she go if she gave offense to the man whose roof and ticket and entire proposed future she had accepted? She could not go to Daniel, because what she suspected of Daniel had no polite shape, so she carried it alone. Through the suppers and the courtesies, a woman reading 4 languages and unable to say the one true sentence in any of them, and she understood for the first time that being right about a thing is no comfort at all when you cannot say it out loud. She did not confront either of them that night. She was a guest, alone, 600 miles from anyone who knew her name, engaged in all but ceremony to a man whose ranch was her only roof. And she had not survived the collapse of her father's world by being reckless. She watched instead. She watched for 3 days, and what she saw broke her heart twice over. She saw that Thomas Garrett was not a bad man, just a limited one, a man who had bought a wife the way he bought a horse, and was now, to his credit, trying clumsily to be worthy of a woman who plainly outmatched him. and she saw that the quiet brother Daniel was the author of every word she had fallen in love with, and that he was killing himself trying not to show it, leaving rooms when she entered them, answering her in monosyllables, holding himself so far back that the holding back was itself a kind of confession. When she finally cornered Daniel, in the ranch office that smelled of leather and ink, she did not raise her voice. She held up the ribboned stack of letters, and she said, "Who wrote these?" He could have lied. He looked at her, and the lie was right there, and easy. "My brother dictated. I only held the pen, and it would even have been technically defensible." He did not take it. "I did," he said. "Every word, he signed them. I meant them. I had no right to mean them, and I meant them anyway, and I have hated myself a little more every day since you stepped off that coach and looked at him expecting me." Clara stood with the letters in her hand, and the anger she had been carrying for 3 days went out of her all at once, because there is no staying angry at a man telling you the most painful truth he has. And what was left underneath the anger was the thing she had felt reading those letters in an empty house, and it had a face now, and the face was the wrong brother's, and she did not know what in the world she was supposed to do with that. She watched Thomas trying over those 3 days, and the trying was almost the saddest part. He had clearly been told by someone, by Daniel she would later realize, the things the woman in the letters cared about, and he produced them stiffly, like a man reciting a part he did not understand. He mentioned a book she had written about. He got the title slightly wrong. He asked a question that had obviously been fed to him, and then could not follow up on her answer. And Clara watched a proud man flounder in the shallows of a courtship written by someone else, and she pitied him, which is a poor foundation for a marriage. And she watched Daniel, who was watching her, and who left every room she entered as if she carried a fever. She caught him once in the doorway of the office, caught his eyes before he could shutter them, and what was in them was the whole of the letters. The tenderness and the dry humor and the held-back ache, all of it, plain on the face of the wrong brother for one unguarded second before he limped away. She stood in the yard afterward with her heart going hard and understood that she was in a far stranger trouble than a disappointing match. She was engaged to a man she felt nothing for, and falling, against every grain of sense, toward a man she had no right to. And the 2 men were brothers, and she was alone in their house, 600 miles from anyone who could advise her. What finally forced her hand was a small mercy and a small cruelty bound together. Thomas, trying, brought her a gift, a writing desk he had ordered from the territory's one good carpenter, because, he said, a woman who kept books should have a proper place to do it. It was thoughtful and it was wrong, and the wrongness was unbearable, because the man who would have known to give her a writing desk was standing in the doorway watching his brother give it, and the gift that should have been tender was instead the clearest proof yet of the whole crooked arrangement. Clara thanked Thomas and meant it, and went to her room and sat on the floor and did not weep, only sat, until she had decided that whatever it cost, she would rather know the truth and lose everything than live 40 years inside a kindness wearing the wrong man's name. What followed was not a clean thing, and the story does it no service to pretend it was. There was a wronged brother in the middle of it, and a roof, and an arrangement, and Clara Whitfield was not the kind of woman who got to her own happiness by stepping over a man who had been, by the plain terms, cheated of his bride. So she did the hard right thing instead of the easy romantic one. She went to Thomas, and she told him the whole of it, the letters, the authorship, all of it, and she braced for his fury. Thomas Garrett surprised her, and surprised Daniel, and possibly surprised himself. He was quiet a long while. Then he said that he had known, somewhere, that the woman in the letters and the woman who stepped off the coach were looking for a man he was not, and that he had told himself she would come around because that was easier than admitting his brother had given her something he could not. "I wanted a wife for the ranch," he said. "Daniel wanted you. Turns out those are different things. I'm a fool, but I'm not fool enough to make a woman spend her life paying for my pride." He released her from the arrangement that same hour, with a grace none of them had expected from him. And he did one more thing that told Clara the Garrett brothers shared more than a name. He gave Daniel a quarter of the herd and the deed to the south parcel, the good land by the creek, and said it was owed for 4 years of books kept and horses gentled, and a brother's honest work done for a hired hand's thanks. "Build your own place," Thomas said. "Stop living in mine." And so Clara Whitfield did not, in the end, marry the rancher whose advertisement brought her west. She married the brother who had answered it, on the south parcel by the creek, on land that was their own, and the man whose name had been on the letters stood up at the wedding for the man who had written them, and the 2 threads that had snarled so badly at the coach, finally, after all, ran as one. The confrontation in the office was the bravest thing Clara had done since boarding the train. Braver, maybe, because on the train she had at least been running toward a hope, and in the office she was walking toward a truth that could leave her with nothing. She held up the ribboned letters and asked who wrote them, and gave Daniel every chance to take the easy lie, and watched him refuse it, and the refusing was the thing that finished her. A man who would lie to have her she could have resisted. A man who told the painful truth at his own cost, who had hated himself daily, rather than deceive her 1 inch further than the original sin of the signature. That man she could not arm herself against. "You had no right," she said, because it was true and needed saying. "I fell in love with a man who does not exist. I crossed a country for him. I have been sick 3 days thinking I had lost my mind, that I had imagined the whole person I wrote to, and the whole time he was real, and standing in the corner holding the horses, letting me think I was a fool." "You were never the fool," Daniel said. "I was. The man you wrote to is real. He's me. And the worst thing I ever did was let you find that out by accident, instead of telling you the first honest day." She stood with the letters and could not decide whether to throw them at him or hold them to her chest, and that indecision, she understood, was its own answer. The place they built by the creek was small at first and then less small, and Clara kept the books, of course, in a hand even Daniel admitted was better than his, and Daniel gentled horses for half the territory, until ranchers drove their worst animals 40 miles to leave them, with the quiet man with the limp, who never raised his voice, and somehow always got results. She kept the ribboned letters in a drawer of the office that smelled, she made sure, of leather and ink. She did not need them anymore, having married the man who wrote them, but she kept them for the same reason a person keeps any proof of how they got somewhere unlikely. On winter evenings, sometimes, she would take one out and read it aloud, and Daniel would protest that he could not believe he had ever written anything so forward, and she would remind him that he had signed his brother's name to it, and he would say that was the only forward thing about it, borrowing the courage along with the name, and she would let him have that, because it was nearly true. Thomas Garrett never married. He visited often, and was a good uncle to the children when they came, and ran his ranch hard and well and alone, and once, late, with a glass in him, he told Clara that sending for her had been the best mistake of his life, because it had been the only generous thing he ever did by accident. There is a line the writer Owen Wister put in the mouth of one of his Western men, that when you call me that, smile. A line about the difference between an insult and a joke being entirely in the spirit behind it, and Clara thought of it the night Thomas said that, because the word mistake from him was not an insult and not quite a joke. It was a hard man's way of saying he was glad, and she smiled, and so did he, and the thread held, all 3 strands of it, for the rest of their lives. Thomas's grace, when it came, was the more remarkable for how little anyone expected it of him. He was not a generous man by habit. He had bought a wife the way he bought stock, and he had every conventional right to be furious at a brother who had, by one reading, stolen her. But Thomas Garrett, for all his hardness, was not a stupid man, and he had spent 3 days watching the woman he had paid to bring west fail to light up at anything he said, and go still and strange whenever his brother entered the room, and he had drawn the correct conclusion before Clara ever held up the letters. "I could hold you to it," he told Clara, in the same office, the morning after she confronted Daniel. "You answered my advertisement. You took my ticket. By every custom, you're mine to marry." He let that sit. Then he set it down. "But I'd be marrying a woman who'd spend 40 years looking at my brother across the supper table, wishing, And I'd be making Daniel spend those same 40 years watching, and I find I haven't got the meanness for it. I wanted a wife for the ranch. I can hire what the ranch needs. What you two have, you can't hire, and I'm not going to be the man who stamps it out to save my pride. Clara had misjudged him, she realized, the way the letters had let her misjudge the whole arrangement, and she told him so, and Thomas almost smiled and said most people did, and that he found it useful, mostly, and only inconvenient now. The releasing of Clara was done quietly, with none of the public spectacle a jilting usually brought a frontier town. Thomas simply let it be known that the arrangement had not suited either party, which was true enough, and that Miss Whitfield would be staying on in the territory, which was also true, and the town, having little to go on, contented itself with the version it could see, which was that the bookish lady had thrown over the rich brother for the lame one, and could make of that whatever it liked. Clara found she did not care what it made of it. She had crossed a country to escape a town's opinion of her once already. She was not about to start living by a new one. Daniel did not believe it at first, that Thomas would let her go, and certainly did not believe the part about the land. He had spent 4 years as the brother who received, and never the brother who was given, and Thomas pressing the deed to the south parcel into his hand, undid something in him that the war and the limp and 4 years of margins had built up hard. He tried to refuse it. Thomas would not hear the refusal. You kept my books 4 years for a hand's wages, and never once skimmed a dollar I'd never have caught, Thomas said. You gentled every horse on this place. You wrote the letters that brought a good woman west, and then you near killed yourself not taking what your own words earned. I'm not generous, Daniel. Ask anyone, but I know what I owe, and I pay it, and I'm paying it now, so take the deed before I remember I'm a hard man.